really happy today to have Greg Pack, who is Assistant Professor of Economics in the College of International Studies, and we're going to talk about electricity prices and counter economic growth with relevance to Allegany County.
So, yeah.
So thank you, Greg.
Can everyone hear me? Is this on? No, I don't. I live in Tompkins County in Ithaca. So, anyway, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. So, my specialization is in economics is really international economics. And over the last few years, I have done quite a number of papers on energy and electricity, environmental regulation, but all on the European Union. Right, and so I started looking at the US last summer because I figured this would be more relevant to people in this country. And so I produced a working paper, and so this lecture is really inspired by that working paper. And again, it's on electricity prices and economic growth, but initially, and I have an outline, so I will not only just talk about what I've done, but I will give you a sort of an introduction into this topic about electricity prices and really also about electricity consumption and how this relates to economic growth. Right, so I'll talk about that. I'll talk about the electricity markets, and again, just a general overview of electricity markets in the U.S. and New York State. I'll mention a little bit, just to give you some graphs and pictures about the local area. And then finally, I'll talk about my research. So what's my contribution to this topic? So first, electricity and economic prosperity. This is something, this connection, we know it's there. We have known this for a long time. We're not sure how it's connected, and I'll get to that in a second, but we know it's there. When you're talking about electricity prices and not consumption, there was the really first major work on this was by the US government commissioned a paper, a study in the early 80s. And what they found was that electricity prices directly affect electricity as inputs of production, which makes sense. Companies need electricity to produce, and if prices tend to be high, this will indirectly affect their productivity, and therefore it will affect economic growth. Right? So government started sort of noticing this in the 80s. Right? But the actual relationship between energy consumption and energy and GDP and growth, we know this already. This has been studied for longer than that. And so the first thing I want to show you is this really cool map I found. So this is our planet. And so this is how it looks at night. Right? I don't know if you've seen these pictures. You might have seen some of these pictures. The more recent ones people look at is Korea. Here's South Korea. And right here is North Korea. So this is what you see more. But what a lot of people don't know is this next picture. So this is GDP density. So basically what this tells you is GDP, or economic prosperity, per square kilometer. Right? So, and so what do we observe here? Right? So this, right? They're quite connected. Right? Does this make, right? And so the countries, especially this is, I think this is 2007. If you looked at it for, let's say, earlier in the 80s, you would see obviously China and India being a lot less red. And so there will also be a lot less lights then. And there are also these maps, they have them. But this is the most recent I can find. So again, so you see the direct connection. So there's no, we don't have to really establish it. There is connection there between these GDP and electricity consumption. And so before I talk about the relationship more, just to make sure that everyone is familiar with all the terms, what do I mean by GDP and economic growth? So GDP really is the gross domestic product. The reason really people use it is because it's, in some ways, it's the most widely known way to measure economic performance. So it's just your value of all the final goods and services produced in a given year. Right? And when we're thinking economic growth, we think about increase in real GDP, so from year to year. So we adjusted for inflation. Right? We adjusted for price changes. We want to know what's the real output and not what price, the fact that prices went up. Because you can have a situation where the economy actually doesn't produce as much, but prices go up, and so it looks like GDP is going up. Right? But so we really want to look at economic growth. And the factors that affect economic growth, and again, I don't really teach, I'm more of a microeconomist. I don't teach much of the macro things. But the factors that affect economic growth, we break it down to this aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And so more of you might be familiar because it's really mentioned more in the news, aggregate demand. So here you're thinking consumption, investment, government spending, exports. Right, so this is aggregate demand. What is it impacted by? Well, this is impacted by interest rates, by prices, real wages, by banking sector. And so, for example, in 2008 and 2009, when we had a collapse of GDP, the banking sector was affected, housing affected real incomes, and so all of this affects GDP. Now, what they don't talk much about, or at least not as much, is the aggregate supply side. Right? So this is economic theory says, well, if you have to look at them together, and aggregate supply is just the total of how much companies produce, supply. And so what is this affected by? Especially when you think in the short run, it's not going to affect anything that much, because consumption and investment will drive production. But what about the long run, right, when you think 20, 30 years? And really the key three things are infrastructure, right? Infrastructure, which one of them is your electricity grid. Another thing is what we do here at the university, human capital, so education. And then finally, technology change. Right, so technology change, when you think about electricity, I haven't really read much about this, but there's this huge movement to basically, within the next 20 years, 30 years, revamp the entire electricity market. So moving away from, you have generators, they transmit it to the utilities, and they sell it directly to you. Well, they want to revamp this entire market and basically put you in control of your own electricity. Right, so this is they're calling this project, some states I see, Utility 2.0. Well, I know. Right. Basically, take charge of your own electricity, so consumers will be able to generate, sort of, be part of what they call this microgrid. So if you have sun panels, so the solar panels on your roof, and you're producing electricity, you should be able to sell this electricity. Right? And you should be able to control your electricity through your iPhone. Right? Everything. You should know exactly how much you're pricing, how much you're paying for electricity at any given moment. And so I see that they're starting to do this. They're putting, they're running some test cases in a couple of states are doing this when they're, voluntarily asking people to install these smart units into their house, so people actually see how much they're paying for electricity at any given moment. Right now you don't. Right now you open up your bill and I see, well, paying X amount of dollars for last month. Right? So but they want you to know exactly, because this will change your consumption behavior. Right? So anyway, so this is GDP and economic growth. And then back to electricity and the connection. So there's a lot of research in economics about the direction of causality. Right? Direction of causality in electricity and energy consumption. Because this is important. And so there's lots of written basically saying, all else equal, does growth cause more energy consumption? Or does energy consumption cause more economic growth? And so there's these four hypotheses. The first one is neutrality. They call this neutrality hypothesis. And so basically they're saying there's no relationship between the two. They're correlated, but there's no causal relationship here. The second one is what they call this conservation hypothesis. So GDP growth causes energy consumption. Now this is important, because if this is true, then this implies that any policy dedicated to conserve energy is just, there's no point to it. It will not impact economic growth. And then the third one, growth and growth hypothesis. So energy consumption causes GDP. And so here, if you restrict energy consumption, this will have an impact on GDP. So we shouldn't restrict. And if you encourage people to use more energy, this will be better for the GDP. And there's obviously some anecdotal evidence for this. When I was putting presentation, it was nice because then I can go back and read all these little cases. Like in the 70s, we had a major embargo, oil embargo. And so what happened? So they restricted the energy, prices skyrocketed, and we had a little recession. A little. And then finally, we have this feedback hypothesis, meaning the causality flows two ways. And I can tell you there's at least 100 papers written on this, maybe more, and there's no consensus. We don't know. We don't know really what's the direction. Economic literature can't tell. It really depends on the data and the type of model that it's used. For the US, it's also inconclusive, although I've seen more recent papers that they're hinting, but they can't be sure at this feedback hypothesis that really that might be flowing two ways. But there's really no consensus on this. The important thing they do mention, economic literature mentions, is that you should study this in the 4 sectors: residential, commercial, industrial, transportation. That this link may vary by sector. So that's the overall. And then a little bit about U.S. energy markets and New York State energy markets before I go to what I've actually done. So here's the electricity and GDP in the U.S. And so the relationship over the last since the 50s. And so what you're looking at here is the growth rates, right? So the yearly growth rate for electricity and GDP. And so you see the pattern is the same, but up until the 80s, really we were consuming more electricity. That it was growing faster of our energy consumption, electricity consumption, than the GDP. And sometime around 90s, this has changed, and now we project, and it's already happening, where we are the electricity growth rate, consumption, how much we consume, has slowed down. It's much lower than our GDP. And so why is this? And so this is sort of nice because it reveals what's happening in America. Right? So one of the things is our population growth has slowed down. Then we have just the shape of the industry. The U.S. industries has changed. We have moved away from energy-intensive industries. Right? So, a couple of the, if I can give you an example of a couple, what I found most intense, electricity-intensive industry, I think the #1 is cement industry. They use a lot of electricity. Metal industries, also glass. I thought that was sort of interesting, glass. Alfred being known for glass. That's very electricity intensive. And of course, we have improved our technology. So your average refrigerator right now consumes about 1/3 of electricity it did 20, 30, 40 years ago. Right? And we have all these plans to conserve energy. Right? So make it more efficient. The government subsidizes low-income families with weatherization programs, right? So just to conserve energy, right? So because of that, we still project that electricity will be positively growing, but it will be definitely sort of it will slow down from what it used to be. And again, that's sort of, it's nice because it sort of shows you how the economy has changed, how our society has changed. A little bit of electricity markets in the U.S. in general. So since the 90s, we have entered this phase of deregulation. Before, it was really utilities controlled the generation, the transmission, and the distribution of electricity. Right? So the way electricity works is you have, and again, I'm not an electrical engineer, but you have production of electricity, then it's transmitted through power lines to the final utility or some kind of organization that then sells it to the final consumer. And so they have broken this up, these 3 things, and now a given utility is allowed to own the distribution and the generation, but not the transition. The transition of electricity has to be open so that if another organization wants to tap the lines, they have the ability to do so. And so this is nice. And so it has increased competition. So this unbundling of these vertically integrated processes. But what has happened is that, okay, one, more competition. But then we get this other evidence. For example, I don't know how much you know about California energy crisis in 2000. And again, I just read a little bit about it. And so there what happened in California is you had deregulation of the wholesale markets. So there was a price competition in the secondary market, so these wholesale. But the retail market was regulated still. And so what happened was, this was actually also Enron had some fault to do, some manipulation of energy supply would cause spikes in prices, especially in the summer of 2000 when the weather was nice, everyone wanted to use it. They manipulated, restricted the supply of electricity. Prices on the wholesale market increased a lot. But then the utilities couldn't sell to final consumers at these high prices because the retail market was still regulated. And so they went bankrupt. It caused them, their margins virtually disappeared. The people who were selling the electricity, there was one main electricity utility in California went out of bankruptcy. Another one almost did, and they found Enron was definitely restricting supply, and all these wholesale traders were also doing this. It was just a good business for them, but this was a lot of illegal manipulation. And so this was, again, one of the things that resulted out of deregulation. You also, I found this was also interesting, Texas. Texas deregulated some parts of their market, and we find there's just a new report, 2014, that people in deregulated areas pay significantly more than in regulated areas. So we like competition. We know in economics competition is good in most industries, but we see here in electricity maybe this isn't the case. Right? Maybe it's not the case. Right? So there's some questions that we need to ask. Just a little bit more electricity markets in the U.S. So the composition of how is your electricity generated. So for the most part in the U.S., we have always got electricity, majority of it from coal. And so even up to, this is data for 2011, but even I would say in 2005 and 6, about 50% of all your electricity was in this country was generated by coal. Now this has been shrinking. We have been moving away from coal. Right now, this is 2011, 2014, we're down to about 37%. Right, so we have moved away from coal, and we're actually moving to natural gas, which makes sense because you're given utility, especially bigger utilities, they have multiple plants. They generate from both coal and gas, and all they do is they look at which one is cheaper, and since we have had a lot more natural gas and it's cheaper, they just substitute away from coal into natural gas, and so we have been moving away from that. And of course regulation. Natural gas is twice as cleaner. It's a lot cleaner than producing to coal. The good news for U.S. coal industry, this is just a little bit extra, we actually export a lot of coal to the European Union. And so I have another paper that we were working on the European Union and their emission standards, and since about 2009, European Union has seen a growth in coal consumption, which is, they don't like this because it's very polluting. But we sell them a lot of cheap U.S. coal, right? And their gas, because I'm sure you've been following their whole, they get most of their gas from Russia. And so those prices go up. Futures prices go up because there's a lot of uncertainty. U.S. coal is cheap. They're going to be burning a lot more. And they do have all these emission standards, but they're not very strict. They're not as strict as they would like them, so they're working on this. So it's anyway, a whole nother topic. A little bit more electricity markets in the U.S. So they're governed, about 60% of all electricity is governed by these regional transmission organizations. So this is who sort of coordinates, it's either independent, nonprofit, membership-based, controls, monitors electricity transmission grids. And one of these areas is New York. Right? So they don't produce electricity, they just monitor the transmission. So from your the producers to the final consumer, so even the wholesalers, they monitor the price. Right? So that they sort of, again, it's just this nonprofit organization that watches over transmission. And so this is, most of U.S. is governed by these RTOs. And here I found another, but I just threw this one in. So your U.S. average residential price of electricity. And I have to say, I think the data shows New York pays the most. Electricity prices in New York are the highest. I really don't know why, but they're the highest. Right, so this is the prices of electricity. And this actually matters, and I'll get to it. Well, not only for my results, but there's some other economic literature that I'll talk a little bit about why this actually matters. And so here's the electricity market in New York. So like I said, it's this independent system operator controls the grid, make sure everything functions well. Town of Allegany County, so Allegany County and including town of Alfred is in this central zone, C. So this is where we are located. Electricity market, so residential is about 35%, commercial 53%. Most of our electricity comes from, what's it called here, natural gas, followed by nuclear. I was actually surprised, which makes sense. New York doesn't get a lot of electricity from coal. So we are very much more nuclear and natural gas and hydro. So this is where we get our electricity from. So the way that New York prices work, which will be a little bit different than what I show you in my data, but the way New York electricity prices work is that you have these load service entities. So this is the demand side, people who purchase electricity, then to sell it to you, the final consumers. So these are these load service entities, and then we have these generators provide offers. And so you have the generators provide the electricity, you have load buy this electricity, and this is governed by this New York independent system operator. And they set the price, and the price is what they call this LBM, so locational based marginal pricing, which is in dollar per megawatt hour. And so basically this is the cost to serve the next megawatt of demand at a specific location on the grid. Right, so this is, and you actually see this on a daily basis. I think they refresh it every 5 minutes. Right, so here's our zone. And so here is, right now, if you wanted to buy as a utility for sale to final consumers, you would pay $40 for megawatt hour of electricity, right, if you wanted to buy it from New York. Right. So you see it on a daily basis. Now this is, I have no idea what happened here. Something happened here. I don't know. When you see this, you really no idea what happened there. So somebody made money, right? Somebody did. So, but anyway, another nice thing about studying electricity, and there's just lots of information. And it's really, they track it minute by minute. Right, and so there's lots and lots of information on electricity. So finally, my research. So what do I actually do? So I examine the effects of production electricity prices on the GDP. And so I look at the residential, commercial, industrial, these sectors at a very disaggregated level. And unlike, I'm not really interested in the causality of of this. What I talked about economic literature, like I said, there's about 100 papers that look at the causality between consumption and GDP. I'm more interested in how, from a microeconomic perspective, how much is GDP affected when the electricity prices increase? Right. So when electricity prices increase, what does this do to the... And so you don't study this, it would be impossible to study this on a daily basis or even monthly basis, because we could never know the changes in GDP. So you really have to study this on an annual basis. And when I started working on this paper, I spent some time already in this last summer working on it, and I was like, well, I just have to make sure that this makes sense, right? And so I started looking then for around what has been written. That's usually what I do. I first work on a paper for about a month, and then I go and find what have other people done, right? And so I was actually very happy to see this paper by Khan and Mansour. So these are the two top really energy economists, some of the best energy economists in the country. And their approach and what they're doing is very similar to what I've started working on, except instead of looking at the economic prosperity, they look at firm location, which is actually in some ways very similar. And so what they find is that energy-intensive industries definitely locate in low electricity price counties. So firms are very conscious of electricity prices. And so if you, especially the energy intensive, they will, if they're making a choice of building your next factory, they will look at electricity prices, which therefore will very much affect employment in a given region. Right? So this is again, which again, I don't know how much you can attribute to the decline of New York State, but having high energy prices will not attract energy-intensive industries into the state. And so this is what you see in this research. Anyway, so this is what I'm looking. So I'm not looking at the macro-causal relationship. And again, the nice benefit of this is that I really am looking at the disaggregated county level, which means if you looked at just the state, then all the electricity prices changes and GDP changes within a given county would be treated the same way. But we know that it's not true that Allegany County and counties in New York, around New York City, they're not the same. And so when you look at this, you really can't treat them the same. So you have to study this at a more disaggregated level. Another nice thing about what I've done is the Bureau of Economic Analysis doesn't produce GDP numbers for counties. They only produce them for state and some metro counties. And so there is some statistics and econometrics that you can do to actually estimate GDP counties. So I've went and I actually estimated GDP counties for every U.S. county for the since 1999. And so I found data from the EIA, so this is U.S. Energy Information Agency. They collect lots of nice data about all kinds of energy things and electricity. And so they have revenue, sales, customer accounts. And so based on the revenue and sales, you can then calculate electricity price. So it's a little different than the price that I just showed you. So this is, the utilities report their monthly sales. I think it's monthly sales and monthly revenue. And so based on that, you can calculate their electricity price that they're charging. And so I've linked this to U.S. counties because a given utility obviously operates not only with one county, but they can operate in many counties, and they can operate across state borders. So what I've done is I looked at their actual where do they have equipment for distribution, in what county. And so if I link the utility to their distribution equipment in a given county, and then based on that I can identify what utility is operating in what county. Obviously, this makes an assumption that if a utility has distribution or equipment for distribution, they're actually using it, which it doesn't always have to be a case. And so then I linked that to the counties, and then I obtained some data from U.S. Census, Bureau of Economic Analysis, and Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so I compiled this quite a large data set on 161,000 observations, which is a utility county year observation. So this is the data I've compiled. So it has quite a lot of nice statistics there. And based on this, then I calculated the GDP for each county, which again is not calculated by the BA. And so I used this methodology that was developed by these economists in 2012. And again, I'm not, I didn't put any equations or anything how this is all done. But it's basically using earnings data. And so the BEA does report earnings data on the county level and the state level. And so earnings, so all the earnings for non-farm and farm earnings. Right? So they work by sum of wages and salaries, disbursement, supplements to wages and salaries and income. So that is collected on the county level. And so based on that, you can then calculate, approximate GDP of a given county. Which again, it's nice because if you ever see a lot of work that which is done on counties, a lot of the rural counties are always left out of the analysis because they just simply don't have the data on it. And so and then again, living in this area, I think it's nice to add this information. All right, so before I show you my result, I just want to give you so I pulled up, so from this 160,000 observation, I cleared out all the data and just left Allegany County just to see how this looks. So here's the electricity prices and GDP for Allegany County from 1999 to 2011. And so residential price is in dollars per megawatt hour. So your average price ranges from about 60 to whatever, $90 per megawatt hour. And which again, it's a little different than the graph I showed you before, like I mentioned. And then the GDP from 1999 was about 750 million to about 1.1 billion. Which I don't know if this seems high. For first I thought about this, I was like, this might seem high. But it's actually not that high if you think about it. The earning information and then how many people live in Allegany County. The statistics I found about 50,000. Right, so 50,000, so 1.1 billion divided by 50,000, that's about $20,000 per capita. So it's not high, and it's actually very consistent with what I've seen some statistics. So it made me feel better that all this econometrics and when you compile this data, that's like, okay, the results actually make sense, which is always nice to see. Right, and again, we had we had some dip. It doesn't reflect the recession as well. Maybe I should have included. I also have unemployment numbers for Allegany County, and there you do see a big dip in 2008, 2009, just like the rest of the country. And then I thought this would be interesting. The graph by utilities. So this is the prices by the utilities that in my data serve this county. So you have New York State and Electric, Niagara, Rochester, and then you have village of Andover, Angelica, and Wellsville. And as you can see, the prices of the villages, they're much lower and they're very consistent. Whereas for the New York State and the upper ones are not. Can you guess why? I mean, there might be other reasons. One of the big things that at least my data shows. But this is all. These 6 utilities serve Allegany County. So this is just for Allegany County. Any guesses? Yeah, I mean, like that might be. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't ask questions. I don't know. I don't know individual. The big difference, at least in the data, is that the 3 bottom ones are municipalities. They're public. Whereas the 3 top ones are investor-owned. They're private. And so you see, people own it, city, private investors. Well, that's a big difference. And I'm sure they have all kinds of contracts in these villages. But I thought that was sort of interesting. So, all right, so finally, my results. So what I find is that in these 4 sectors, so sector by sector, if you increase prices by 1%, this will decrease GDP by about 1.3% in residential. And this is very significant results, which is not surprising given that I have 160,000 observations. But it actually, when you do some robustness check, this checks out. For commercial increase, so 1% leads to a 0.6 decrease in GDP. For industrial, 1% increase in electricity prices leads to 0.3 decrease in GDP. And for transportation, it's 0.4. So what does that actually mean in terms of Allegheny County? So if you have an average annual residential price increase by 1%, so when I showed you that price, so let's say if it's $50 per megawatt hour. Right. So if you increase it by 1%, that's going to be 50 cents, right? And so then that will decrease approximately 1.3 GDP, so about $14 million. And again, this has to be put in context because this might seem like a lot, but what people do is that there's this effect. Not only what I'm talking about, like the the other papers show, companies leave, they relocate, but really your consumption, spending, the way you spend your money changes, right? If you suddenly see increases, you substitute away from one thing that might increase GDP to other things that lower GDP. And I looked at some other statistics. Average U.S. consumer, I think, spends about 1.5% of their annual earnings on electricity. And so when I actually think about it through those terms, it might be a high number, but I think it's not unreasonable for a county. And also, the last thing is affects different consumers, different income groups differently. So this is something else we have to be very aware of, that people in a very low income bracket, and they spend a lot higher portion of their income and energy than the higher income brackets. And so again, there's some of these assistance programs, these transfers that we have, such as the weatherization program and whatnot. This is something important, and it makes a difference for people. Because again, the people in the lowest income brackets spend way more money on energy and electricity than people, relatively, than people in the upper income brackets. So anyway, I thought this was interesting too. Questions? Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. Right. 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 Yeah, I would imagine there would be. I don't know enough about server farms. Yeah, right. I mean, it is a very electricity intensive, obviously process. From the stuff that I read, the only way, and this might be one of them, the electricity will make a bigger comeback as far as growth rate, is they say the car market. Right? Once the car market really takes off, that really might change the growth of electricity again in this country. Servers, yeah, I mean, they do obviously use a lot of electricity. I haven't really read enough about them to make a comment. So, question? So this is for my entire data set. So this is not just, so this is based on my entire sample of all U.S. counties, and I just applied it to the example of of Allegheny County.
So I'm surprised that the industrial was less of an effect than the commercial, and I'm wondering why that is. I would have expected the industrial to be using more.
Let me see. I thought it wasn't. Um, so commercial might actually be higher, because industrial, at least in New York State, is a very small part of electricity consumption. Yeah. But yeah, I guess the commercial might be. This might vary by state by state. So this is. It would be nice to actually look at the. I thought that electricity consumption for all of U.S. I don't have a slide anywhere. Consumers are the the biggest sector. So, other questions?
I live in Allegany County.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure if it's the same case in Allegheny, but periodically there's discussion about legality and changing, extending the state regulations that allow businesses to have access to cheap hydro power. Does that distort the market if they do certain?
For them to have access to cheap electricity?
Yeah, there has to be some regulations to allow them to do that.
Just from this, yeah, that would be good. I mean, even from what I first said, with the government, electricity prices directly affect companies. So if they, it's really standard theory of firm. Right? These are inputs into production, and so the cheaper you can make them, your electricity, the more firms you're going to attract. So, yeah, I mean that I would say that's a good thing.
Could you put up the slide of the energy costs across the country, please?
Energy costs. This one?
Yeah. Am I right in thinking that the white hot spot in Washington State is the Columbia hydroelectric power producer?
I don't know.
It looks that's what it is.
Okay.
And I was kind of baffled as to why New York State costs would be so high when there's a fair amount of hydroelectric power. I just wondered if you could make any comments about why the costs are so different across the country.
I mean, the only thing I guess I can say is supply demand. Right, there's just a lot more demand in New York State than up in some of these other regions, right? So if you, right, so in this part of the country, there's just not that much demand relative to as far as the number of people and the manufacturing businesses. Right, so, here's your center of U.S. manufacturing, and that's moving. Right, this is where a lot of U.S. manufacturing is. You have some, obviously, in the south, but you really don't have much manufacturing in these areas. And also, you have less population per square kilometer. And so, I would imagine that has something to do with the supply and demand. Yeah, I don't know enough about individual states to make any more comment.
Getting back to the server question that I was interested in, so my understanding is most of those huge computer server farms that NASA uses are in the West.
Oh, are they?
Montreal areas.
I would imagine, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them have their own power, their own generating ability. Right? They have their own generators. Again, I don't know enough to say, but that would make sense, right? So that they have their own generating generators, because they don't want to rely on your local utility, because if the local utility fails for some reason, all the servers go down. And so, just like hospitals, they usually have their own generators, backup generators. But again, I don't really know. Question?
Yeah, two questions. One is having to do with wind. Do we have evidence at this point that in those areas where there is significant wind power, the electricity generated by wind power, that prices have in fact declined from what they had been before you had the wind farms? And my other question is not exactly related to that. In fact, it's not related at all.